to this ISM Trust webinar on managing hearing loss as a musician. I'm Paul Max Edlin. I'm just going to self-describe myself. I'm medium height, I'm white, I've got a beard and hair, and I wear glasses. And I'm a composer, performer, lecturer, and ISM Trust trustee. You know, I'm really delighted to be joined by percussionist Dame Evelyn Glennie, ear surgeon Chris Aldrin, musician and educator Ruth Montgomery, the ISM's head of charity development Ruth McPherson, and our two BSL interpreters, Anna Kitson and Thaisa Hughes. Now, please pin Anna and Thaisa if you wish to see interpretation at all times. Now, before we begin the webinar, just a few things to note. During the discussion, please feel free to ask questions using the QA function, and we will do our absolute best to answer these at the end. We really want to hear from you. And do keep an eye on the chat box, because that's where we will drop in some useful links. If you experience any technical difficulties at any time, let us know in that chat box and we'll attempt to resolve it. And if you wish to use them, subtitles and BSL interpretation are available to enable at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording with you afterwards, as well as a feedback survey, which we'd be very grateful if you would fill in. Now, the ISM Trust is the ISM's sister charity, which offers high quality professional development to everyone working in music. And through the Trust, the ISM gives back to the sector and supports and empowers music professionals to succeed. Really vital stuff. We produce award-winning events, training and resources, which are largely completely free to access. Now, I'm actually really very pleased to hand over to our panelists, who I will invite to briefly introduce themselves in this order. Firstly, Dame Evelyn Glennie, then Ruth Montgomery, and then finally, Mr. Chris Aldrin. Over to you, Evelyn.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to participate in this panel. My name is Evelyn Glennie, and I'm a musician. I have long grey hair, I'm white, I'm wearing glasses and wearing all black, and I'm sitting at my office in Cambridgeshire.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Ruth Montgomery, and I'm a musician and flute player, and I have a charity, Audio Visibility. Today I'm wearing a dark blue top, and I have a short brown hair and I'm white, and I have a plain background behind me. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Aldrin. I'm an ear surgeon based in Windsor, and I've got a particular interest in surgery for hearing restoration. And also I'm a violinist and have developed a particular interest in helping musicians with hearing loss. I'm on the advisory council of the London Philharmonic Orchestra, and I also play with the European Doctors Orchestra. And a quick plug, I have a concert at the Cadogan Hall with the Doctors Orchestra on Monday, the 18th of March. Very much looking forward to chatting to you about the issues with hearing, and particularly for musicians.
Thank you so much, Chris. Well, if I may actually do a plug for the Doctors Orchestra, because when I worked at Queen Mary, I had a lot of fantastic medical students who were phenomenally gifted musicians and played in that orchestra, and I hope still do. Chris, now, if we may stay with you to explain fundamentally how the ear works and how noise fundamentally damages it. I know this is going to be a really fascinating and illuminating few minutes. So, Chris, it's over to you.
Okay, let me just see if I can share the screen. I hope very much to be able to do that. That looks hopeful. If you can just tell me, Paul, if you've got that.
Yes, I can see that.
Okay, so We're going to talk a little bit about hearing, because I'd like to explain how we hear, because that will help us understand how we have problems with our hearing, and also how we can prevent noise-induced hearing loss. So we'll look at how we hear, types of hearing loss, the causes of hearing loss, management of that hearing loss with particular emphasis for musicians, and then the cause of noise-induced hearing loss and how we protect ourselves. So if we start off with how do we hear? Well, we've got this funny thing stuck on the side of our head, the pinna or the outer ear. And when you look at it in detail, it's really quite complex. And that allows the pinna to have certain acoustic properties. It will focus particularly high frequency sounds towards the external canal. It also helps us localize sound. And because of its shape, it has a resonance frequency which amplifies sounds around between 2 and 5 kilohertz. And of course, it physically protects the ear canal. So we're now looking and hearing what's happening. So the sound is coming down through the pinna, down through the ear canal, which is a 1 inch, 2.5 centimeter canal lined with skin. And at the bottom, there's a thin piece of skin called the eardrum. And attached to that is the malleus or the hammer. And the handle of that hammer is attached and moves through the thumb, which then moves the 3 ear bones, the malleus or hammer, the incus or anvil, and the stapes or stirrup. And that transmits sound into this thing here, which I hope you can see, which is the inner ear. So here's our eardrum, beautiful thin piece of skin stretched with the malleus or the hammer handle attached to it, and that vibrates with the sound. And here we can see the hammer, and right next to it for size, we can see a 1 cent coin. So it's got a handle and a head, and it's just this handle. It's the only bit of the ear bones that's attached to the eardrum. And then that transmits the sound through to the incus or the anvil. And finally, it transmits it to the tiny little ear bone, the stirrup bone or stapes. And this is a bone that I spend a lot of my time operating on. And as you can see, it's very small. It's 3 millimeters. The base is 1.5 by 3. So I spend a lot of my days operating on that. And they transmit the sound through to the inner ear or the cochlea. And it's a spiral and it's embedded in bone, but it's full of fluid. And it connects with the balance organs, the semicircular canals. And if we do a cross section through the cochlea, we can see that it's got 3 separate fluid compartments. And the sound comes through this lower fluid compartment, the scala tympani, and it moves this basilar membrane, and that displaces these tiny little inner hair cells, and they are what send the signal to the brain and allow us to hear. And they are attached or hit against a tectorial membrane. Now, there are some outer hair cells, and they're very interesting because they don't send a message to the brain at all, but they receive a message from the brain, and they can tune the inner ear and change its sensitivity. And they're extremely important in hearing and very important in hearing loss, and we'll see that shortly. So here we can see these beautiful hair cells, the inner hair cells all lined up, and then these rows of outer hair cells. And there are 20,000 in each cochlea, and the cochlea is about the size of the tip of your little finger. And they are super, super delicate, and that is important in hearing loss. And when the inner hair cells move, they have some tiny little physical strands that join them together. And as they bend, they open up and they allow high levels of potassium to run into the cell, and that depolarizes the cell and sends the message to the brain, the action potential in the nerve fiber. So here we can see the sound coming in, moving the basilar membrane and displacing these inner hair cells which bump up against the tectorial membrane. And that movement opens the ionic channels and allows the nerve impulse to send to the brain. That's in a nutshell how the ear works. So the inner ear itself is what we call tonotopic. So it's a spiral, and different points along that spiral are responsible for different frequencies. So as the sound comes up, it sets up a traveling wave with a peak that is represented by the different frequencies. And the inner ear sends the nerve impulses into the midbrain and then all the way up to our temporal lobe, to the cortex, where we perceive our sound. And there's much that we don't understand about this, but we do recognize that the different frequencies are represented at different points along this journey. At each point, the frequencies are kept separate right up to the cortex. And what's really fascinating is how the brain itself influences what we hear by feeding back to the inner ear and working on these inner ear hair cells. So I've got an example which I hope will really demonstrate to you how important the brain is. So I want you to listen carefully to this short script and see if you can work out what it says. So it's quite hard to get that. Now, I'm going to now play you something that shows you.
The police returned to the museum.
I'm going to play it once again for you.
The police returned to the museum.
And we're now going to go back to the first one, and you should find now that it is much clearer. Oh, sorry. I'm just going to go back a slide.
Police returned to the museum.
So when you know what it says, the police returned to the museum,
Police returned to the museum.
Suddenly becomes much easier to hear. Although it hasn't changed at all, it's our brain tuning our ear and being aware of what's coming. And we're now going to do the same just with a little short piece of music. It's a well-known tune played electronically, but each note is in the right, it's the right note, but not necessarily the right octave. See if you can recognize it. Now, I know lots of you are musicians and some of you may recognize it straight away, but if you should recognize Yankee Doodle. We're going to play it once more in the right octave. And then we're going to go back to the original again. Oh, sorry about this playing up. So hopefully you find when you've listened again, it's much easier. So that's a bit, just gives a bit of insight on how the brain influences what we hear. And that's particularly important when we talk about using hearing aids. So we're now going to have a quick look at sound, which, as you know, is defined by frequency or pitch and amplitude or volume. And the pitch of the ear that we can hear when we're young is from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And if you remember, middle C is 256 hertz, concert A 440 hertz in the UK, and the piano covers a range of 27 hertz to 4,000. So a young, healthy ear is able to hear a lot of sound, almost another 2.5 octaves off the top of the piano. And the ear is exquisitely sensitive at detecting frequency differences, or as we might say, intonation, tuning. We can tell the difference between 1,000 and 1,002 hertz. But unfortunately, once we hit 20, we start losing our hearing through aging. The ear also has an incredible sensitivity. So at the threshold of hearing, the movement required is 1/1000th of atmospheric pressure. And at the threshold of pain, 130 decibels, it's 10,000 billion times louder, or 10 trillion times louder. And the problem with that is we're talking about volume in terms of the actual sound pressure, then we get, the numbers get too big. So that's why we use the decibel scale, and that is a logarithmic scale that allows us to talk from 0 to 130 or 140 decibels. And just as an example, we usually call 0 decibels the quietest sound that a very healthy young ear can hear. And 20 would be a soft-spoken whisper. I'll be speaking now at 60, 65 decibels. But look, a solo violin playing mezzo forte, 85 decibels. Solo horn playing mezzo piano, 90. Cymbal clash, 130. Jet engine, 140 decibels. So that shows us the range that we will experience. Just sticking with decibels because they're quite important to understand hearing loss. A 3 decibel increase will double the sound intensity, but it requires a 10 decibel increase, 10 times the sound intensity, for a perceptual doubling in volume. One trumpet playing mezzo piano is 90 decibels. 2 identical trumpets playing together would be 93 decibels. So there's twice the sound intensity, but it does not sound twice as loud. What we do know is that long-term exposure of sound levels greater than 85 decibels an hour for 8 hours a day is known to damage hearing. This is what we call the speech banana. So we've got frequency along the top and volume in decibels down the side. And this is where the important bits of speech lie. So for normal conversational speech, around about 40, 50, 60 decibels, and the sh, s, and th sounds are high frequency, and the vowel sounds, a, r, o, u, they're all low frequencies. And then if we look at environmental sounds, we've got pianos up at 80, 90 decibels, rock bands, 120 decibels, but also for noise-induced hearing loss, lawn mowers, 100, 110 decibels, helicopters, aeroplanes, lorries, all around 100 decibels. So let's look at normal hearing. This is a normal audiogram going from 250, so near to middle C, up to 8,000 hertz off the top of the piano. And the further you come down this audiogram, the deafer you are. And normal hearing is above 20 decibels at the top of the audiogram, with the right ear in red, left ear blue. So how common is hearing loss? 20% of the adult population have got a hearing threshold below, I think it says 30 decibels. Let me just take that out of the way. I'm just going to move the speech box. Of 25 decibels or worse. So they've got some hearing loss. And 30% of adults will admit to having difficulty hearing in the presence of background noise. If you look at older adults, 55 to 74, a third say they have problems with their hearing. 14% have hearing loss greater than 35 decibels, and they would definitely benefit from a hearing aid. Only 3% have hearing aids. So there's a massive unmet need in normal adults. This is not musicians. If we look at musicians, overall, they have slightly better hearing than the general population. However, as their lifetime noise exposure goes up, many of them have got hearing loss at around 4 kilohertz, and they also have increased rates of tinnitus or abnormal noise in their ears. If we look specifically at musicians, 33% of classical musicians will have hearing loss, and a massive 63% of rock and pop musicians. Tinnitus is similar at 25% in both groups. Hyperacusis is where loud sounds are unpleasant, and that is common in both. And diploacusis, which is annoying for musicians, where you have different sound perception and perceive frequencies differently in the two ears, is in up to 8%. So what types of hearing loss are there? Well, there are basically two broad categories. There are conductive hearing losses, where the sound does not get into the inner ear. And there's a sensory hearing loss where the inner ear itself is damaged. And they are quite different in how they occur, but also in how they are treated. So conductive hearing loss might be earwax, an infection in the ear, a hole in the eardrum, or fluid in the middle ear. And most of those can be managed surgically by someone like myself. This is an area I've got a particular interest, otosclerosis, where the little stirrup bone gets stuck by abnormal bone growing on it. And I spend my day trying to fix these problems. However, because the only problem with conductive hearing loss is the sound doesn't get to the inner ear, these patients generally also do well with hearing aids. But the other big group, which includes age-related loss and noise-induced hearing loss, is sensory hearing loss. And this is when the inner ear itself has been damaged. So if we look at normal aging, this is the hearing test of a 60-year-old, and we can see they're beginning to lose the higher frequencies down to 50 decibels. And if we keep going to 12, 16, and 20,000 hertz, there would be no hearing. This shows us where people begin to get difficulties. So that 60-year-old is just entering the yellow zone where they're definitely going to have problems in background noise. Our 80-year-old, however, has moved significantly down and is going to have trouble even without background noise. And all of these 80-year-olds, almost all 80-year-olds, would benefit from hearing aids. The problem with sensory neural hearing loss is in the vast majority of cases, the only solution is hearing aids. And although hearing aids are very helpful, all they do is make things louder, and they do not mend the damage that has occurred to the inner ear. Sensory hearing loss is often associated with these other things: tinnitus, diploacusis, and hyperacusis, and distortion that I mentioned. So what about hearing aids for musicians? So this is rock musician Pete Townsend, who wears hearing aids and is open about the fact that he has noise-induced hearing loss and has tinnitus. Musicians worry about wearing hearing aids because once you wear a hearing aid, if it's seen, they worry that it signals a hearing loss. And hearing aids are not perfect for sensory hearing loss, although they are undoubtedly usually very helpful. Some of the aids have got specific programs for music, but one of the things I really want to emphasize is what we saw with the brain altering our ability to perceive sound. That also works with our brain altering our ability to use a hearing aid. And therefore, hearing aids, you need to persevere with them. When you first start, you may be disappointed, but over time, you're very likely to find them more helpful. And in orchestras, they are not always perfect for hearing music, but they're often very good for hearing the conductor, if you feel you wish to do that. So what about noise-induced hearing loss? You may have seen this movie called The Sound of Metal, where Riz Ahmed is a drummer and suffers a severe catastrophic loss of hearing with very loud tinnitus. Now, it's not exactly clear in the film the cause of his hearing loss, but there's no doubt that some of his hearing loss is from noise damage. So noise-induced hearing loss, one of the key messages here is that it is usually insidious. It comes on very slowly over a career, and it is irreversible damage to the outer and inner hair cells. So it seems that the noise causes a buildup of toxic metabolites that structurally damage those hair cells. It generally has the worst hearing loss at 4 kilohertz, and it causes a loss of speech discrimination because the high frequencies are lost. The vowels tend to mask the consonants, and there's a particular problem of hearing in background noise. And this is the classic audiogram of someone with relatively early noise-induced hearing loss. So the low frequencies are fine, but when we get to the top of the piano, the hearing is dropping down, and then it comes back up, and that differentiates it from the age-related hearing loss, which goes down. But of course, the two things are additive. So just having noise-induced hearing loss doesn't keep you young. So who gets it? Well, it's worst in brass players. Violinists tend to have more exposure in their left ear, and percussionists have problems because of the very high peak intensity of their exposure. We can quantify noise exposure in terms of a daily equivalent sound, and that's called an LEPD. It doesn't particularly matter, but our lifetime exposure is called the noise emission level, And that is important in terms of our risk. So if you have a daily average exposure of 90 decibels for 10 years, that would give you a noise emission level of 100 decibels. 85 decibels for 20 years gives you 98. And it's this 100 figure that really seems to be the key thing in terms of getting significant hearing loss. So one of the things you might do as a musician is have a portable sound meter. And fortunately, these are available on phones. When we look at the law says if you've got 80 decibels, you need to offer hearing protection to your employees. At 85 decibels, you have to make sure that hearing protection is given. You must perform risk assessment. You must try to control noise and reduce risk. You must provide information and training, and you must provide audiometry. And therefore, the orchestras and bands should all be doing this for you. Let's look at recreational noise. So it's very important as a musician to think about your exposure at work, but also your exposure out of work. So nightclubs tend to have average levels of up to 100 dB, opera singers 100 dB, rock concerts over 100 dB. And you need to think about how you can reduce your recreational noise risk. So these are free apps available on iPhones. This is one I have. This was a short burst I had on the tube a couple of days ago, and you can see the maximum was 98 decibels. So that is damaging, and therefore you should be wearing ear defenders of some sort when on the tube. And these are the sort of things you can have: foam plugs, adjustable plugs, or over the head cans. And all of these are very helpful to reduce noise. Musicians often want custom-made molds because they give a nice flat frequency response, which is very helpful for hearing. It means that things are quieter, but quite clear with no distortion. Most professional rock musicians will use active in-the-ear monitors where they have fold back, where they hear their own sound in the ear, but also protected from the noise on stage. This is a device called a hearwig, which is to protect particularly woodwind musicians from the noisy brass and percussionists behind them. It's a Swedish device, and almost all Scandinavian orchestras use these now. And these are some other acoustic shields that can be used. This is similar to the hearwig. These are perspex shields that are placed around, for instance, a drum kit, or placed behind the violinist to protect them from noise from behind. So for yourself, you should try to avoid noisy hotspots. It's good to place staff away from loud areas, create quiet areas, offer ear defenders and hearing tests for staff. In musicians, I would recommend you get one of these decibel meters. It just gives you good insight to what you're exposed to. Remember that it's noisy practicing your instruments, and where possible, use mutes to practice. Use acoustic shields when working, but use earplugs, and particularly when you're practicing, it makes sense to use earplugs. Look at your own recreational sound exposure. For instance, you should be wearing ear defenders when you're mowing the lawn, vacuuming, and the orchestra should be trying to place musicians at different levels. So I think that's all I want to say. I know that's quite a lot to take in, but I hope it gives a reasonable basis for us to continue our discussion. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing now.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. I knew that was going to be a very illuminating thing. Our ears are so fine, so delicate. It's hardly surprising that if we misuse them or we push them too far, they're going to get damaged. The level of, but we just treat these things. The sad thing is, I wear glasses now, and one of my big problems, these are varifocals. So when I buy these varifocals, apart from they cost a bomb, I have to adjust my eyes, my brain has to adjust a little while. It's just the same as you were talking about with hearing aids. Well, very, very important. Now, that's a lot to take on board. And so we're going to have a little moment, 5 minutes, almost break, while we can sort of think about all that you have said. I'm just going to ask Ruth McPherson to give a very brief presentation about the Musicians Hearing Health Scheme of the ISM. So if I can pass over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Paul. My name's Ruth McPherson. I'm Head of Charity Development at the ISM, and I want to talk to you about the Musicians Hearing Health Scheme, which is a scheme that is available to musicians all over the UK to help you protect your hearing. So the ISM Members Fund is one of the sister charities of the ISM, along with the ISM Trust, and the ISM Members Fund has entered into a partnership with the Musicians Hearing Health Scheme. And this is one of the services that ISM members can access in terms of health and well-being through the ISM Members Fund. Other services cover areas like physical, mental and financial well-being, such as counselling, physiotherapy and financial advice, as well as hearing health support. So what is the Musicians Hearing Health Scheme? Well, it's a scheme devised by the charity Help Musicians, which aims to make hearing protection an affordable and an essential part of a musician's toolkit. We've been hearing about how important hearing is to musicians, and this scheme gives UK musicians affordable access to hearing assessments and to bespoke hearing protection, which can be quite expensive. So it offers discounts to make this more affordable and accessible to UK musicians. And the ISM Members Fund joined the scheme as a partner in 2023 to allow ISM members to access even further discounts on the scheme. So the Members Fund subsidises the scheme for ISM members. So why should you access the scheme? Well, as we've been hearing, hearing is a very basic tool for musicians, but it is very fragile and it's at risk of damage. And unfortunately, noise-induced hearing loss is 100% irreversible, but the good news is that it's also 100% preventable. And through this scheme, you can protect your ears with discounted audiological assessments and custom-made hearing protection. So what do you get as part of the Musicians Hearing Health Scheme? Well, firstly, you can access an audiological assessment and a checkup from a specialist in musicians' hearing health. Those specialists are from our partners at Musicians Hearing Services, and that assessment is worth up to £100. You also receive a set of custom-made bespoke ACS Pro Series earplugs, which are worth £149, as well as advice on referral routes and next steps if you need it to manage any further problems. And again, if you need it, there is the option of wax removal at a subsidised rate of £50. And how much does it cost? Well, for non-ISM members, it costs £50 to access everything that I've just described as part of the scheme. But the ISM Members Fund has further subsidised the scheme for ISM members, as I mentioned. So ISM members can now access the scheme for £37.50. So that's a huge discount considering everything you get in the package adds up to around £200. And luckily, the scheme now includes student members. So we've just added student members to the scheme as part of a pilot. The pilot is limited to 50 ISM student members. So if you're a student member of the ISM, I would advise you to get in touch with us soon to apply for a place, as that is limited. But for all other grades of ISM membership, you can apply and there are unlimited places. So if you'd like to access the Musicians Hearing Health Scheme, you can head to our website, and the URL is on the screen there at ism.org/musicians-hearing-health-scheme. And there's also a QR code on the screen, which you can scan using your mobile phone to check out the scheme and read more about what it offers and eligibility and how to apply. So I hope you'll all consider applying. It's a fantastic scheme if you're interested in protecting your hearing and accessing affordable hearing health support. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth. You know, it's always a pleasure to be part of the ISM because of the work it does. And I think this is a particularly important thing, very timely, because, you know, hearing is just so vital. Now we're moving to a period of about 40 minutes in which we're going to be discussing a range of things, and I'm very pleased that questions are already coming in, and they're very interesting inevitably. So we're going to be putting them in. So if you've got questions, I've got one here. I have receptive dysphasia. Will this condition be mentioned in this webinar? I'm going to make sure it is. So please put those questions in. And that'll be obviously following this section here. Now, of all musicians who have championed and really transformed the way in which people perceive music and hearing loss, there's no greater champion in the world than Dame Evelyn Glennie, and it's really wonderful to have you with us. Evelyn, I've got some questions for you. My first one, there are a multitude of degrees of hearing loss. Can you just briefly explain yours and how you've overcome so many seeming obstacles?
Thank you, Paul. Yes, I began losing my hearing from the age of 8, and it was a very gradual process. At that age, of course, I wasn't aware that I was actually losing my hearing, but I was very much aware of the circumstances where I was functioning well and functioning not so well. So I was becoming much more comfortable in being in more isolated situations whereby I could control the environment I was in. And then by the time I was about 12 years old, I was dependent on hearing aids. Now, of course, this is back in the early 70s to mid 70s. And so the hearing aids really did help to hear a lot more. And it gave me this kind of huge sort of world of sound, but it didn't give me the sound that was needed to understand and to connect emotionally with the sound. So by this time I was playing the piano, and I was also introduced to percussion. And of course, the thing with percussion is that it has so many frequencies, so many impacts of sounds, and many different types of durations. And so this was extremely confusing. And at that time, I thought that in order to hear something, it needed to come through the ears. And so, of course, this was affecting, the aids were affecting my balance, they were affecting my sense of touch and the sensitivity and relationship to sound. So, and basically the enjoyment, I just lacked the enjoyment of what I felt internally I was able to do. So I felt inside of myself that there was this sensitivity, but I was not being able to manage this because of the amount of sound that was coming in this part of the body. And it wasn't until my percussion teacher actually said, Evelyn, why don't you take your hearing aids off? And of course, you heard much less coming through the ears. But he struck a drum and he said, can you actually physically feel that sound? So, of course, I was able to hear the impact of the stick coming down on the drum, but what I was missing was the journey of that sound. So I was missing the resonance, and I was missing the pitch as well. But what I could get was actually the feeling of that sound through my hand as I popped my hands on the wall. Now, that was a complete and utter revelation, because bit by bit, of course, the journey has all been about opening the body up as like a huge ear and trying to distribute the sound through the entire body, as opposed to trying to decipher it through the ear. And of course, this changes from day to day. It changes depending on the mood you're in. It changes according to the acoustics. It changes to the instrument that you're playing or engaging with. It changes to the clothes you wear, whether you're sitting, whether you're standing, the type of stage you're on. I mean, there's so many variables there. So if you play, for example, the pitch C on a marimba, and then you play the same pitch on the same make of a marimba in another venue, you might feel that quite differently. So you can't just assume that, well, you hear that and you're definitely going to hear it, in another situation. So this is all about connecting with living sound, with sound that is happening there and then. And so that's why it's quite difficult to connect with sound through something like a laptop. Because it's not something that the body is connecting with. There's nothing there for the body to actually feel, to physically feel. So you're not feeling that, the sound coming through your tummy, the sound coming through your feet. That doesn't happen. So for me, the relationship with sound is when I'm actually creating it myself or being in the sound. So you almost become the sound, but it isn't just dependent on that instrument. There are so many other aspects as well to consider.
Now, that, of course, raises the big thing about how musicians actually relate with other musicians, how they hear music or listen to music. And I know this is a big thing for you. But obviously, when musicians are working together, they are looking at each other. They're feeling the vibrations that are going on around them. And that can be an extremely satisfying feeling. It's a sense of human bonding. And I think it's fair to say, just because you have hearing loss, and obviously if you've been a musician all your life and you're getting gradual hearing loss, the last thing you want to do is lose that immensely powerful bond. You talk about hearing and listening, and I'm very aware that much of the music you play, you love using open fifths and fourths, because I imagine they provide you a sort of rich resonance yourself. Is there anything that you would like to say, particularly about that issue and how you define listening as opposed to hearing?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this goes right back to the beginning and how we learn a musical instrument, how we talk about music, the vocabulary that is used. We assume that when we learn a musical instrument, that it's all about hearing it. But it's amazing how all of our senses become part of the process in playing an instrument. And I'd love for this to be developed and be made more aware of right from the beginning. And thinking, when you're playing a scale, we're asked, well, you must practice that scale and play it perfectly and so on. But what are we trying to do with that scale? What sort of story are we creating with that scale? How does it emotionally feel, physically feel? And what does it feel like if we play that scale outside? Or what does it feel like if we're playing it in a school practice room? What does it feel like when we play it in the school hall or in another type of environment? And to really start describing these things and how it affects our interpretation of what we do as opposed to translation. And that's where the difference comes in. And I'd love for that sort of thing to be addressed much, much earlier on, so that we're really, addressing the whole kind of bodily experience in listening and trying to define the difference between hearing and listening. So, yeah, I think that we can perhaps cultivate more what is inside of us and what are we trying to get out, as opposed to trying to feed something inside of our system and then deciding, are we doing it well, not well, oh gosh, we have to practice that more, and so on. So I think that's definitely very, very important. And I think when we're talking about intervals, and you mentioned the fourths and fifths, they're just wonderful kind of open, balanced sounds. You feel as though you're absolutely grounded there. And I think, again, this is something that when we're listening to the musical ingredients that we engage with, it's thinking, okay, what is it? How is it relating to that particular individual, as opposed to waiting for the teacher to say how you should feel? So if this is cultivated much more early on in the development stages, I think that we would be much more comfortable with improvisation, for example, with experimenting with different sound colors through our instruments. That's obviously something that is been really important for me, and it's opened up many different musical avenues. I think that we would understand more and validate more the creative process, our independent creative process in what we do, and discover sound worlds through our instruments that perhaps is away from that printed page.
Now, I know your answer to this question: should people be afraid of pursuing or working in music, particularly from an early age, or if their hearing starts to diminish? You're going to say absolutely. But one question we have received, and you touched upon this earlier, how can or how would you best explain to somebody or to stay motivated while learning that instrument and suffering, those potential frustrations, particularly in the early years, or as an older person, as they are losing certain elements of their hearing and the fear that goes often so associated with that?
Well, there are a lot of elements to your question there. And of course, every individual will deal with their particular journey in their own way. But I think that in my case, I was so fortunate to have a teacher who created another entry point, as it were, to sound. And of course, it was about thinking, okay, we have a young pupil here who is very interested in music. Obviously, he had no idea how or what kind of journey that would become, and neither did I, of course. But nevertheless, it's making sure that young people are given that opportunity, that we do not define people in what we think they should be, but absolutely understand what makes that person passionate about what they're passionate about. And so I was very fortunate in that the school that I went to believed that every child has a story to tell. And I think that we all open up our packages in different times. So, and that's very important, I think, to be aware of, that we just all progress in different ways. We use different routes and so on. And really, I would absolutely say that if you are passionate about music, if you are curious about music, and I think that word curious is very important, because that will help with the longevity of your journey. You have to understand, and I'm sure we all do, that any profession has its ups and downs. And the funny thing about music is that you see people perform and you think they must be enjoying it 100% all of the time. And of course, that isn't the case. We are going through this emotional roller coaster at times. And that could be for many, many different reasons. And we all need time to just back away from something. And then we feel inspired again, and then we need to back away, or sometimes we feel a bit down and then we're up again. So these are important because they're experiences that we can draw upon when we're interpreting music. Music isn't always happy. Sometimes it's that interpretation needs that feeling of sadness or despair or frustration or whatever it might be. And so, yes, it's a very interesting subject, but I think there are so many people to talk about. Things like this particular seminar now allows us all to talk about our own experiences, and it's important that we're able to share those.
Absolutely. Well, Ruth, if I may, Montgomery, if I may bring you in as well into this, because this is your world as well, and we know that there are very many musicians with varying degrees of hearing loss. Can you describe some of the practical strategies deaf and harder of hearing professionals use as musicians, for example, tuners, positioning, score reading, etc.?
Yes, sure. My hearing loss is profound, and I've had it since birth. So my journey is very different from many musicians who lose their hearing later in life. But I can tell you the strategies that I knew to help me to become the flute player I am today. though it will be relevant to many people. For me, having a tuner really helped. I play long notes on my flute and I can do the tuner, the line that goes roughly in the middle. That gives me the pinpoint, and I learned to hear this and listen to this. I know the character of every style because I practiced them long notes, playing them loud, playing them soft, taper away your style. So the tuner is a really good tool. Another thing is timing. Once you know pose, rhythm can float on top of it. So if I'm playing in an ensemble, you just know your pose. It's just the rhythm and pose they're working together. So you need to keep watching others if your tempo goes quicker or slower. So you develop that intuition of playing with others as well as listening. I also practiced in different rooms. So it could be in the conservatory, it could be in the bathroom, it could be in the normal room that I have. Because that's how different also playing out of doors. So you get used to playing all this. This is giving yourself strength and preparation. Also, if you're playing in an orchestra or ensemble, I would read the whole score. It just helps me to understand what others are doing. Sometimes on my music sheet, I would just put cue, like the oboe will come in, the violin will do the, and all those information. So when I'm playing, I can do this person gonna come in and all that. So again, it's where I position myself in an ensemble, or if I'm playing with a piano accompanist or a guitarist, I'm just feeling where that person is, we can communicate, you know, gentle enough. And also, I wear analog hearing aids. Digital hearing aids does not work for me. It just modifies so much of styles around me. So with analog hearing aids, it's like it's open, it's there for me to hear what's out there, and I can adjust the styles and follow. So that works for me. So those are my tips.
It's worth mentioning, obviously, that musicians. I recall a fantastic former student who was profoundly deaf, and an oboist, and she was the most attentive member of the orchestra. She never made a single mistake, and she used exactly those sorts of systems that you have described. Um, Now, what support is there in place for those who lose their hearing later in life?
I think it's a combination of two things. If you lose your hearing later in life, as a musician, it's important to know your strength. So, for example, Beethoven, he lost his hearing later in life, but he was already a composer and a piano player, so he continued to write more music and he was writing great pieces for piano as a performer. And the same for Dame Evelyn Glennie. She just continued as a musician and she really made her understand what percussion instrument is, just made it bigger. So she's playing on her strengths and everything, what you can bring to the world. So I would say, think about your strength. And also, I have listened to stories from other musicians who have told me, oh, it doesn't sound the same again. I'm grieving for what I used to hear. Eventually, it will have to become your new normal. When that becomes your new normal, you can kind of start to look into moving forward about where you are. So you can do your GP, go to audiology, have your hearing tested out, try a hearing aid, and then you can play. But I would say you should bring your instrument with you to the hearing test. So I bring my flute with me, my piccolo, I try out all settings. So those are the advice I would give.
Now, I think there are many musicians who are frightened about discussing hearing loss, terrified, and musicians' work is tenuous anyway. So an added complication. I know you're going to say you shouldn't be frightened of hearing loss, but what about how musicians should relate with employers? How should they relate, perhaps with their school and colleagues? What would your advice be to them? And what should those people in positions of authority who are employing musicians, what should they start to now be thinking about when they're dealing with an issue that actually, as we now know, when you're 20, you're going to start losing your hearing in varying degrees, and most of the people they're going to be employing are over 20.
That's a lot. I would say, first of all, you have to remember the musician who is losing their hearing. Remember what they have achieved, playing in the orchestra. Look in their CV, their work, and that's what you have already. And also think about what you can bring to the organisation as well. People will be more patient, communicate a lot better, and just be more face-to-face communication. Yes, it's about your strength really. I wish people wouldn't be so afraid anymore. And we have to remember 3 babies are born deaf every day. So that's quite a huge number. Deafness is here to stay. Music is for everyone. We talked about the tragedy, and we will tell them what works for us, what they can do. You have to meet halfway. We have to be given a chance. We need to reduce the stigma.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Ruth. Now, Chris, you've had a little bit of a break, but I've got, my goodness me, there are so many questions that have already come in, and I can see, and it's wonderful to see a raft of questions already coming as a result of this afternoon. How many musicians have you supported, and do you support, and what conditions do you come across?
Right, so I must see some new musicians every week in my clinic, and that's been going on for many years. So I've been running my clinic for 27 years, but as time goes on, you sort of get more of a name for seeing musicians, so they find their way to your door. And I see everything from musicians who've got a slight distortion in one ear, but are very concerned that that may become worse and it's come on suddenly. Lots of musicians who have tinnitus and again are worried about how very often the musicians that I see are concerned about what might happen, not necessarily what has happened, but what might happen. Will this be progressive and get worse and worse? And a big part of my job is to check them over, check their hearing, put their concerns into context, and very often say, well, it's unlikely, this is very unlikely to get worse, or if it gets worse, it's going to be very slow. So I think a lot of the musicians who see me have their ears checked, hearing checked, have a consultation, go out relieved that actually they're not on their own and it's not the end of the world. But equally, I see musicians with all other hearing problems. Of course, musicians are not protected from having other conditions that are not noise induced. So I know one of the delegates has otosclerosis, which is this abnormality of the little ear bone, the stirrup bone, and I do an operation where I replace that. And I've operated on a number of musicians with that, with good results. I operate to repair holes in eardrums of musicians and all the things that I would do for any member of the public. But then there's also quite a big group who've got noise-induced hearing loss. And that really depends on the magnitude of the loss as to what we do. But a lot is of advice on how to protect their ears going forwards. A little bit of that is with orchestras as well, me advising orchestras on what they should be doing and employers. And then unfortunately you do get some patients who maybe have sudden complete loss of hearing. Usually that's just one ear, but we do get musicians who sometimes have catastrophic hearing loss, which clearly can be very difficult, particularly when it comes on suddenly mid-career. Fortunately, that is uncommon. So all sorts. I mean, I see musicians with all sorts of hearing loss. And the classic ones, I guess, the diplocusis, which many people would not really worry about. You know, you get a violinist who comes and says, you know, I'm hearing 440 in my left ear and 443 in my right ear, and it's driving me nuts.
Yeah.
And that sometimes comes on suddenly, but usually that settles down. And again, they just need a little bit of time to let that settle. So some of those things which are quite subtle, your average member of the public may not worry about. And of course, musicians notice much, much more.
It's worth pointing out that you're a very fine violinist, and you were actually demonstrating that the tiny, tiny area in which you're working, being a very fine musician and being able to use your hands very steadily, is a great help to a surgeon, as a plug for people to study music, even if they don't go into it.
Yeah, and I see it the other way sometimes when we're interviewing doctors at the beginning of their careers. I quite like to see proficient musicians, amateur musicians who have become doctors, because I think they clearly, you know, pianists are great with their hands, fiddle players really good with their hands, and those skills transfer definitely over into surgery, for sure they do.
Absolutely. So I'm taking it that you're suggesting that people should not be frightened about going and getting a consultation. If they've got any sort of tentative signs that they feel that they're anxious about, it's better to seek advice.
I really think, I mean, the consultation is completely confidential anyway. So, I mean, we normally would write back to the general practitioner, so it's kept in the medical record, but that's a confidential record, and we don't have to do that if the people absolutely don't want that. But I think it's really worth doing, because what's the worst thing is sitting at home or sitting at work worrying about what might happen, not knowing that actually there are another 25 people in that orchestra who've got worse problems than you, who don't want to talk about it. You know, there is this huge stigma with musicians with their hearing that they don't want to admit they've got a problem because they think their job might be on the line, or people might think less of them if they admit to having a hearing loss. So you might be sitting a desk partner who's got hearing loss and you've got exactly the same problems, but not prepared to talk about it. So as Ruth was saying, if you can get rid of that stigma a little bit and talk a bit more about it, a little bit more openly, I think that's a great thing. But very often when musicians come to see me, I think they just leave relieved that actually it's not as bad as they thought it might be.
Good. Now, in the actual practical terms, do they go to the doctor first, and when they've seen their doctor, be referred to someone like yourself? How do they go about it?
Yeah, so normally you go and see your doctor. I mean, on the NHS, you are able to, although your doctor will usually refer you to a given ear, nose, and throat surgeon, you are able to request people, and it's worth doing a little bit of background work to find out who might be interested, because both with the doctors, but also the audiologists who work with musicians with hearing loss, if you get somebody who understands music, it helps a lot. I don't work on the NHS. I'm sufficiently old that I've retired from the NHS, so I only work privately, apart from a very small amount of specialist work I do at Great Ormond Street. But basically, I work in private practice, and I do see musicians. But you know, there are lots of, I don't want to see all musicians in the country, so there are lots of other competent ENT surgeons there who will understand many of the issues that most musicians have.
Yeah. Now, you've spoken about the precautions that musicians should take. And I don't think one should overemphasize that. I think it's, it's something that really, really you should take seriously. One question that's come in: can an ordinary hearing test, as an audiologist, tell you whether you are hearing the outer pitches correctly, i.e. in tune?
So normally they're not pitch matched. So we don't look at, when we do a normal hearing test, we test at these frequencies: 250, 500, 1000, 2000, 3000, 4, 6, and 8000 hertz. None of those are notes that we would recognize on a piano. So 250 is a flat middle C. 500, so we're not actually asking people to listen for a particular tone. However, there are plenty of machines out there that can give you a pure A, and you listen to it and say what you think. I mean, what's quite interesting is that people have, even with people with good pitch have slightly different perception of pitch, even within a group of musicians. But that is not something that we don't normally test pitch perception per se. And one of the interesting things is that, you know, people have perfect pitch, but music pitch is not perfect. My youngest son is a clarinetist in Norway, and they play at a different concert A, a higher concert A than in the UK. So, you know, when you go to Norway as an English clarinetist, you have to relearn what all the notes sound like. They're all just slightly brighter and sharper. So, what's very important for musicians, I don't think it's perfect pitch, but it's relative pitch, being able to hear intervals. And this problem with diplocusis, where the two ears hear differently, that is troubling for musicians. But fortunately, you know, that little demonstration I gave of the gobbledygook suddenly becoming clear when you knew what you were meant to hear, that is in real time, the brain adjusting your ears and what you're expecting. It's remarkable. And the brain is very good at adjusting for changes. So if your ears hear a different pitch, you'll find after a little while they won't anymore.
Okay.
Usually they won't.
Okay. Now I've got lots and lots of questions specific to hearing aids. I think because a lot of people are frightened of wearing them, you know, and being seen to be wearing them. Do hearing aids accelerate hearing loss in the long term in a similar way to running headphones too hot?
Well, no, not really. I mean, most hearing aids have got a peak level, so they don't usually go dangerously high. So no, I think if you need hearing aids, you should wear them.
Okay.
Wearing headphones too hot definitely is an issue. And we
Mm.
see that increasingly in young people across the board who not only have loud noise exposure, but because earphones are so easily available, they have long periods. You know, there are kids who have music playing all day.
Yeah.
That's definitely damaging.
Okay. Are there, I think you've sort of slightly mentioned this one, but are there special hearing aids for musicians? And are there certain hearing aids which are better for classical musicians?
Right. So basically what you have to recognize is, although hearing aids, when you see adverts for hearing aids, they've lots of smiling old people saying they've got crystal clear hearing. If you've got age-related hearing loss or sensory hearing loss, that is slightly disingenuous. They are not perfect. They don't correct the damage to the inner ear that I explained. That is different with conductive hearing loss. If you've got a healthy inner ear and all that happens is the sound can't get through, then hearing aids are great. But hearing aids mainly are designed for speech.
Yeah.
You know, they're trying to get people to understand speech. They have some clever filters on them. They can help with speech and background noise, and they can adjust those filters to a certain extent to try and help the way we perceive music. And different hearing aids have got different filters, but none of them is brilliant. And also, ultimately, it's personal. And so I have a friend who's quite elderly violinist who really struggles playing the violin and has tried lots and lots of different hearing aids and came down to one particular one that he really liked. It really worked for him. And yet, you know, that wasn't a specific violinist hearing aid. It was just one that for whatever reason worked well for him. So my advice to musicians is, if you try hearing aids, you need to persevere with them. Don't give up too early. Make sure you work with them in different environments, a bit of practice at home. You don't go and have to work with them all day, every day in the symphony orchestra from day one, but don't give up on them. But ultimately, if you're really unhappy, try and work with your audiologist to get them retuned and tell them exactly the bits you don't like, what sounds are too bright, what sounds are you not hearing, but also be prepared to work with an audiologist to try different hearing aids and chat to fellow musicians about what they like. But I can't say there's one that is best for musicians and one that's best for classical musicians.
Tinnitus has been mentioned. I've got so many questions here. I'm not going to be able to get them all out. The dreaded tinnitus. Occasionally,
well,
it says,
you say dreaded tinnitus. I mean, the first thing to understand about tinnitus, so tinnitus is an abnormal perception of sound in the absence of sound. So you hear a ringing or a buzzing or a hissing or whatever. That's what it is. It is super common. Probably everybody on the planet will get tinnitus at some stage in their life. So you're not on your own with tinnitus. And tinnitus is just a sound. Now, when I see my patients in my clinic, I say, look, I'm sitting here, there are cars coming past, there's the odd train, we're near Heathrow, there's an aeroplane coming over, my computer's making a noise, that light makes a hissing noise, and I can hear all of those things, but I don't notice them. So I can hear them, but I'm hearing you talk. And whilst I'm hearing you talk, I'm not hearing any of those things. And the reason I'm not hearing those things is because my brain says, you know, we're not interested in the car going past. So my cortex, it sort of downgrades it and switches it off. The problem with tinnitus, because it's in your head and generated inside you, patients get worried about it. And that worry amplifies the sound. It doesn't allow them to forget the sound. I say, when you go home tonight in your kitchen, the fridge will be making an intermittent buzzing sound. And you don't go into the kitchen and say, oh, what's that sound? I'm really worried about that sound. You know, your brain says that's a fridge and you don't really hear it. And what we have to achieve with tinnitus is get you to recognize that it's common, it's not sinister. And then the brain begins to turn it off and you don't notice it so much. And there are things we can do to help with that. We can use, somebody I saw on the chat was asking about using music to mask tinnitus, and you can definitely do that. But again, I give an example. I was very lucky last year at Easter. I went to the Maldives and I've got quite bad tinnitus in my right ear. And I didn't hear the tinnitus at all that week. And it wasn't just because I was on holiday and I was chilled. It was because at night there was an air conditioning unit on. And in the day, there was the waves lapping on the shore. And so some people at night will have a fan on. Some people will have a speaker in their pillow that maybe makes the waves lapping on the shore in the Maldives, and that will drown out their tinnitus and give them a nice sound to listen to.
Okay.
So there's ways of dealing with tinnitus, and the worry people have about it getting louder and louder and destroying your life is incredibly rare.
Okay. Well, that's very reassuring. I've got two questions put together. I think in a way you've answered it, but it's worth asking this again. Is any degree of hearing loss reversible? And if so, how long does it take for hearing to come back, and what does it depend on?
Yeah, so conductive hearing loss, that's my job, is to reverse that. So most conductive hearing loss, if it's wax in your ear, I can take it out. If it's fluid in your ear, I can drain it. If you've got a hole in your eardrum, I can fix it. If your ear bones are not working, I can replace them. And that's what I do. So that side of things, most people with conductive hearing loss, there's a surgical solution and they do really well with hearing aids anyway. If it's something like an ear infection or something like wax, it may reverse on its own anyway. But sensory hearing loss are of two broad categories. There's the progressive loss that comes with age. Yeah. And then there's the rarer sort of loss, which is sometimes what we call sudden sensory hearing loss. So you're going fine and then bang, your hearing drops 10, 20, 30, maybe 80 decibels, goes right down. And that is, we feel that is a medical emergency. The problem with that is that most people with hearing loss like that go to see their GP. The GP looks and sees a normal eardrum, says, oh, maybe it's a little bit dull. It might be, maybe you should take a nasal spray, have some ear drops. And they miss the fact that it's an inner ear loss. And there is a relatively small window of opportunity where if you give patients high dose steroids by mouth, or if you inject steroids directly into the ear, there is a chance of improving the hearing. So we're really keen to see those patients. So that's a patient whose hearing is going along and then suddenly bang, usually in just one ear, fortunately. And if the basic story on that is that the sooner you treat them, the more likely they are to get benefit. And if they get beyond 3 months with no improvement, they're not likely to get improvement.
Okay.
Now, that is a different thing from your brain dealing with your hearing loss. So let's say you get sudden sensory hearing loss, then you may get some terrible distortion, terrible tinnitus, dreadful pitch perception, awful distortion. And that, even though your hearing test does not improve, much of that will improve over time. And that is progressively improves over months and sometimes even years.
Okay, so really again, the answer is if you have a problem, seek help sooner rather than later, and don't be worried to seek help. Now, I've got so many questions coming, and I want to bring those, and I'd like to bring Ruth and Evelyn back in. Ruth, I've got a question for you. How can someone particularly interested in helping deaf students best teach or advise them to discern and reproduce or match pitch?
Okay, it's a good question. I'm a music teacher myself. I usually teach them about pitch by looking at instruments, like chamber, they're really big and make the lowest down, and small instrument make the highest down. So you're teaching them, you're showing them what big and small instrument can do to show pitch. So we are feeding on that information and knowledge. So you start to, once you have that information, it helps you to understand what to listen for. So that's what I do for the pitch perception. And the other question about teaching in the whole class, I would say have visual information like on the wall, what I was supposed to be doing, what, sometimes when you talk things, that's fine, but it's much better if you have music ready or something just to pinpoint where we are and just working in a group and maybe do the same thing together, then break out and then come together. All of those things. I think the music teacher would need to feel and help the student and everyone else to achieve the best in music playing.
You are, of course, a great example of how you reduce the stigma of in young people by teaching yourself, and fantastic. Evan, I've got a question for you, and it's a big one, because you've worked tirelessly to reduce the stigma of hearing loss for musicians. What changes of attitudes have you seen over the last few years, and how much better are things now?
Yes, there's been a lot of changes in attitudes for the better, and partly this is not only to do with the music industry and the understanding of hearing loss, but it's to do with the development of technology, the development of medicine, and so on. The fact that a baby within the mother's womb can have hearing loss detected is incredible, as opposed to perhaps detecting that when they're 2 years old. So that's a huge time difference, whereby a lot of support, not just for the individual, but the whole support system, the family, the educational system, and so on, can really prepare for that individual and their circumstances. So I think a lot has really improved and has had a knock-on effect. The very fact that we're able now to talk about this subject and to understand, what is hearing, how does this operate? We're talking sometimes about classical musicians or pop musicians or folk musicians or jazz musicians or whatever. What we're talking about is sound, regardless of the type of music. We're talking about sound. And we also have to consider, how are we functioning ourselves? So what sort of things are we surrounding ourselves in our everyday lives? What is our sound landscape? We are seeing lots of people with earplugs in their ears or listening to something or another for a very long time every single day. So it's thinking about your sound diet, almost as you would with your food diet. Now, to have a McDonald's now and again is quite nice. However, to have it, 24/7 is absolutely not a good idea. But yet sometimes we feel as though we can feed sound in our system for hours and hours and hours. we have to think as musicians, well, how much time are we spending with our instruments? What is that frequency range? What sort of dynamics are we exposing ourselves to? Now, of course, with percussion, I can expose myself to very high frequencies or very low frequencies and almost everything in between. So in my practice session, I say to myself, I'm not going to play for any longer than 20 minutes. So that is my time scale. And then I give my body a complete break from sound. So I do not intentionally expose myself to sound after that. And then I'll go back for another 20 minutes. So all of the time, I'm really thinking about my sound environment. What is the sound of my kitchen? What is the sound of my living room? What sounds are unhelpful sounds to me? And when I'm talking about sounds, I'm not just talking about the sounds that we're hearing, but also the sounds that we're physically feeling. And because that will have an impact on your mood, on your concentration, it just sort of seeps into your system. So, as we're looking at our devices on social media and so on, well, what sort of, cosmetically enhanced sounds are we being exposed to? So really, really thinking about having a kind of almost sound spring clean. And when we're dealing with, for example, with young children in the preschool age and primary schools and so on, often the types of sounds that they're exposed to are of the higher frequency. So if they're playing percussion, it's all high sounds, shakers, tambourines, triangles, castanets, little glockenspiels, so it's thinking again, what is their sound diet? So what sounds can they connect with the lower part of the body, with the mid part of the body, with their skull and their cheekbones and their neck and so on. So really thinking about the different sound frequencies, the different attacks, and how the body can then, project those sounds. So yes, there's lots of different things to think about.
And really, it's about the physical relationship with sound, because you might have
Yes.
hearing loss, but you're still going to have that same physical sense, which is a very satisfying physical sense, isn't it?
It's very interesting when you have a group of musicians whereby you're setting yourself up in that you can see each other when you play and so on. You can look at each other and you see the facial expressions, that body movement. You see the bow just before it attaches to the string, or the breath in a wind player, or the kind of impact with the percussion and so on. But then if you turn the musicians, have your backs to them so you can no longer see, it's almost as though the sixth sense comes into play. It's bringing all of the senses, the awareness, the space, the chemistry, all sorts of things. And it's just thinking about, well, what is sound in that kind of relationship? So, we've talked a lot about how the brain adjusts and how it needs time. And that's so true. We expect something to just kind of change right now, and we need to understand it right now. But it's this kind of time, and it's a great example with that little exercise, how the difference between looking at a musician and then no longer seeing the musician, but you're still in the presence of them, just trying to determine, wow, so how close is that bow to the string? How close is that breath to producing the sound? How close is that mallet on the surface? And again, that's the sort of thing that can be practiced, because it's the awareness.
Yeah. Now, I've got a host of questions here, and I'm just going to ask both Ruth, because I'm just reading them now, Ruth and Chris to join us back on screen, because I'm going to ask these questions out as I read them. But I think this one here has struck me because, where is it? Here we are. Oh yeah, I think, Ruth, this is one for you. How can musicians with hearing loss leverage their unique experiences to develop new musical techniques, and can specific musical styles or genres be more easily adapted to by musicians with hearing loss? Hope I explained that all right.
I mean, like, music is more than style, it's the language. So for me, I look into the language of music, and the hearing is one part, but a prejudice part. I knew all the elements that support me, what I'm hearing and listening for others. So yes, and also when I play, the feeling is what feeling sounds like. You're having control of what you're producing is coming from within you. And when I read music, I can see shapes and faces and where the music is going with harmony and tension. You see more. So, yes, again, you just play on your strength.
Yeah. I've got a question which I raised earlier, and it was the first question that came in. And a questioner asks, I have receptive dysphasia. Will this condition be mentioned in the webinar? And it's time we did. Chris, I think this is one for you. And what can you explain what this is, and a little insight as to how
Receptive dysphasia is really where you've got a problem understanding either written or verbal language. And it's not really an ear level problem, it's a brain level problem. It's integrating the written word or the heard word and understanding it. And therefore it's treated, it's not treated by surgeons like me. You can't fix that surgically. And usually or frequently it's not associated with hearing loss per se. So hearing aids don't help. And it's more to do with strategy with therapists who can actually work on new ways of actually trying to listen or new ways of reading. So it's slightly different from the mainstream here.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's very useful to know. And I've got one here. I have SSHL, severe level, in one ear, and use a hearing aid in my good ear. But there's no question that comes after that. But perhaps you could elaborate on that.
Well, this is where you've got a difference between the two ears. And actually, there was a question that came through about something called a cross aid. And a cross aid is not an unhappy hearing aid. It stands for contralateral routing of signal. And that's when somebody's got very, very bad hearing in one ear, maybe too bad for hearing aids, but they've got some hearing in the other ear. And you can send a signal from your bad ear to the good ear. So you wear a receptor on, like a hearing aid, on your bad ear. Doesn't do anything to that ear, but it feeds into the other one. And what we sometimes find with people where they've got very severe hearing loss in one ear, you almost end up saying, well, that is not easy to aid, but your other ear where you've got mild hearing loss, we can turn that into a super ear. And so we give you one really good ear, and that's often helpful. And the other thing we haven't really talked on, I mean, things like gene therapy and cochlear implants. Kids now who are born with no hearing get implanted in the first year of life. They go to mainstream schools, and a lot of them do well with music. And although when you listen to the output of a cochlear implant, it's very different to normal hearing. You can, if that's what you grow up learning, you can play the piano. They're particularly good on tuned instruments. Sometimes the fiddle, where you've got to find the note, can be tricky with a cochlear implant, but piano, tuned percussion, really great for kids with trumpet, very good for kids with cochlear implants.
Okay. Well, we are now reaching the end. We've got 2 minutes to go, and I've got just one more question. Do you have any top tips for the ISM as it helps musicians in this hugely important and often hidden issue? Can I go one by one? Evelyn, with you first.
Top tips for the ISM. Well, heavens, I mean, the ISM has just done a wonderful job in bringing these types of events together and allowing people to access information and to ask people, with the huge experience like Chris and Ruth, who are working firsthand with hearing impaired people and with the emphasis on musicians is just a fantastic resource. And for me, it's been fascinating. And I think that it's just making sure that musicians know that the ISM provide this service, because it's just remarkable that such a large percentage of the people working in this industry have some sort of hearing loss. And it is important that we're able to talk about this and to have these kind of platforms to really ask nitty-gritty questions. And there's no such thing as a stupid question. If there's something that is concerning us, or we just want to know more, or we're curious about, we have to have a platform to ask those questions. And then having a follow-up situation, with these events is really important as well. So I would say credit to the ISM. But if these things can happen on a regular basis, because of course there's the next generation of musicians, getting these messages out into our music conservatories and our universities and so on, so that it becomes the norm. We see articles about this in our industry magazines. I'd love to see more of that. So that it really just becomes something that's very, very normal and comfortable, dare I say, for us to be discussing.
I actually think we'd all probably wholeheartedly agree with that. Well, it's now 31 minutes past 6, which brings us to the end
I
of
think.
this webinar. And I would really like to thank our panelists sincerely, and also our interpreters. It's been a really hugely important insight into the world of music and hearing loss. I'm sure that we've discussed many things that will have, opened a door for many people watching. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to everybody who has been watching us as we talk about this. I hope this session has been informative and helpful. And if you have any further questions, because we haven't been able to cover everything, there's so much to this. Maybe there needs to be more talks like this. Please do contact the ISM Trust on enquiries@ismtrust.org. That's enquiries@ismtrust.org. Please also fill in our post-webinar survey. You can find it in the chat, and it will also be emailed on to you. We really appreciate it. In fact, we need your feedback because it helps us improve our services and offer more free professional developments to musicians. The webinar recording will be sent to you by email and will also be available to watch on our website. And I need to tell you about some up and coming webinars. Our next event is a webinar on the 19th of March with parents and carers in performing arts, looking at practical strategies that employers can implement to make flexibility work in music settings. And this is followed by our second Music and Deafness webinar, reaching and engaging deaf people in music making activities. And that's on the 26th of March, but a really important date for your diaries. And we have launched our new resource, Breaking the Singing Barrier, which includes 4 webinars on exploring and overcoming barriers to singing in schools, beginning on the 17th of April right through to the 15th of May. If you have enjoyed this webinar and you would like to support the work of the fantastic ISM Trust, please do consider becoming a friend of the ISM Trust, or even make a donation or leave something as a legacy. You can find out more on the website. But finally, may I thank you all again for watching, and we hope to see you at another ISM Trust event soon. Thank you, Evelyn, thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Chris, and thank you all. And with that, goodbye.